Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. You all get a seat. There's a handout that the man in the green jacket is helping with. As you know, well, this is my last week here, standing here. Next week I will be there with you because Chris is going to start his three-part series beginning with Exodus and moving on. So I will look forward to being where you are next week. As you know, we are using as a year-long study the topic, The Story, which has to do, of course, with the Bible. And many of you have purchased that volume called The Story. Today, that text follows a little more closely than it has what I was using before, the other two lessons. I was thinking about this overall story, and as I told you last week, I used to be in the retail book business. Never have quite recovered from that. And I had this idea because the Bible is it's a bookstore. It's a lot of books collected in one volume. And I thought in those days, if someone had come into me and said, I want something good to read, I would have said, what do you like? And maybe the person would have said, I would have said, do you want fiction? Or not that anything in the Bible is fiction, but do you want a story? Do you want poetry? Do you want women's issues? Do you want, history, drama? What is it you're looking for? And my hunch, if they said, I just want something good to read, I think I would have chosen Genesis, which is the book that, of course, we've been on, and this is our last week with it, because I think it has just about all of those things in it. The first week, we talked about the primeval history, where the characters are really mythological almost. Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and Noah. Last week, we spent a lot of time with the emerging patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. And at the end of the class, we met Rebekah, who is Isaac's wife. And we described her as vivacious and decisive. And I told you I've always thought of her as being like Katharine Hepburn in a way. Today, we have two rollicking family sagas as we continue with the patriarchs and finish the whole book of Genesis. Probably many of you have watched the Roosevelts on the PBS program. Frank and I have been intrigued with it, and I don't mean to compare, for those of you who don't care for the Roosevelts, them to biblical characters, but I will tell you that that family saga reminded me a lot of the stories that I'm going to tell you today. The difference in the personalities, the impact that family has made, and indeed that is the impact that these two stories of these families has made on our faith. I'll go again into the four things or more that I've suggested we remember when we read or study Genesis. First, God is the main character, and that's important today because the farther we get into Genesis, the less apparent God is, the less anthropomorphic God is, if you wish. Of course, it's patriarchal. Women are discriminated against, excluded, and that's difficult, as I say every week. That's just the way things were, and we're so thankful they're not that way anymore. But today, we are going to meet a woman Rebecca, who is a perfect equal to the men in the family. It was a nomadic culture. People lived in tents, and this makes a huge difference. I was thinking how secrets have emerged the more we have closed ourselves in with walls and insulation, and we want to shut out noise. There weren't very many secrets when you live in a tent. Sibling rivalry was very strong in Genesis, beginning with Cain and Abel, and that will follow through often to a tragic conclusion. More of that today. Primogeniture, I've mentioned every time, because while women were discriminated against, for sure, the younger boys were in a way too. It was the oldest or older son who was the inheritor of the family name, the family fortune. And then I said last week that we were beginning to meet tricksters. Abraham played some tricks on Pharaoh down in Egypt. But today we meet the master trickster. Today in the sermon, I said to Chris, who will be back in a minute, but I said I was just amazed sitting there listening to him talk about things that aren't fair and how there are tricks going on and that God has many gracious surprises and many things that they seem outrageous to us. We will visit that very strongly today. Jacob, I think, is probably the pivotal character in the Bible. We hear a lot about Abraham. We hear a lot about Joseph. Nobody's ever, as far as I know, made a drama like Andrew Lloyd Webber about Jacob. I don't know how they'd ever get it all in. The closest would be Shakespeare to dealing with a character like Jacob, because he is, he'll emerge, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. He's obviously the son of Rebekah and Isaac. They are married for quite a long time. She's barren, which is another main problem for women. If they're barren, they're shunned. They passed along their family through children, of course. Finally, she does conceive. She's pregnant, and she's miserably uncomfortable. And she says to God, if this is the way it's going to be, why am I alive? And God says to her, 2 nations battle in your womb. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. That is probably the understatement in all of Genesis. These 2 boys are born. The first is Esau. He comes out, I'm sure most of you learned this in Sunday school, red and hairy, and that's the name, the derivation of Esau. Then comes Jacob. His name means he takes by the heel. He literally, according to Genesis, comes from the womb holding onto the heel of Esau as if he was trying to get out first and be the firstborn. Heel works for him as a noun in many ways. He is a heel in more ways than one. The boys grow up in their parents' tent, Esau the older and Jacob the younger. And over, this is emphasized in the Bible, the older, the younger. There is trouble from the beginning. The Bible, Genesis says in chapter 25, verse 28, Isaac loved Esau, who was a hunter and an outdoorsman, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Esau was tall. He was more like Ishmael. He was an outdoors guy. He was a good old boy, and he was a little dim here. Jacob was short, aggressive, and bright as a lightning rod. The parents have taken sides. The outcome is predictably awful. Rebekah is the only woman in the Bible we follow from her maidenhood all the way through to her death, and she runs everything in the tent. She and Isaac are the only monogamous couple in all of Genesis, if not the whole Bible. And I guess I know why. She wasn't about to let him loose with anyone else. And Isaac is more drawn to this outdoors guy, though Isaac never really was. Remember the first time we met Rebekah, she was so decisive. I've mentioned that more than once, but she may come off again in this sermon today. What's the Bible doing with a conniving, almost heartless woman? One of the men in the bibliography I gave you calls her the Lady Macbeth of Genesis. She's really conniving to work her younger son, her favorite, into the to be the heir of of Isaac. And there is a question here, did she have a sense that he really would have been a better patriarch? Because Jacob becomes, I'll just say his name is changed to Israel. He is the father of Israel. That's what this chart is that you have. You will see the 12 tribes of Israel. That means the 12 sons of Jacob. A con artist. He is the most complex, dynamic, and I think compelling character in Genesis. A real scandal. Again, the sermon today, I just could not believe how things come together. But those of us who are the early workers very often say, it just isn't fair. It's not fair. Well, here you will say that in spades if you're so inclined. Because Jacob basically cons his way through his whole life until finally, happily, at the end, he has a real transformation. I don't know what it is about scoundrels. I can just hear my grandmother saying, Mimsy, he was a scoundrel. She loved to talk about the Bible characters. I felt like she knew the disciples. But it was with this twinkle, and I began to think just this morning, remembering my mother's side of the family, that was this grandmother, they were all really tricksters, and I have inherited a little bit of that, which I take out. I found the perfect object of my trick, and that's my little grandson. I play tricks on him every time I see him almost. He will tell you that. But there's something, not about me, but something about these characters that I always think of, like Paul Newman in The Sting. You know, that Jacob is horrible in many ways, and Esau is nice, dumb, attractive guy. One day, Jacob hangs around with his mom and likes to cook. And so he and his mother have prepared some lentil stew. And Esau has come in from hunting. He's starving. He says, give me that. And I know Jacob played, no, I'm not giving it to you. And finally he says, I'll give you my birthright. Jacob says, well, if you give me that, I'll give you the stew. Now, this is not the big deal, the big transfer. That comes in a minute. But the pattern is already set. I can remember I was older than my brother, and my parents would go out and we'd be left with a babysitter, and he would say, he would eat really fast, and I learned, so I never would eat fast, and he'd say, please let me have some of that. I'm like, oh, this is so good. If you didn't eat so fast, you would. And that's why I think about that every time I think about poor Esau. I just am struck by this because think about the prodigal son. That's the story name that we have given it. That isn't really what Luke meant when he had Jesus tell that story. It's really about the father. The story of the prodigal son features the father as the loving, forgiving, and so forth. And the two boys are secondary characters. But we identify with the prodigal son. Maybe that's why the Bible is the greatest story ever written. But then the real tragic story comes when one day, you see this tent culture, Isaac is ready to bless Esau. He's ready to do the official blessing. And he calls Esau in and he says, I want you to fix me a wonderful meal. Go out and hunt and come back and fix me a wonderful meal. And when you get back, I'll give you the blessing. Now, the blessing in the Bible it's related to the covenant. And these words are very important. In the Bible knows that words count. Many of us grew up hearing that sticks and stones will break, but words will never hurt me. It's not true. I think we all know that, don't we? Words can alter everything. And the Bible, as I said, knows that. And this blessing is permanent. Once it's given, I reminded that when David Cameron said, let me tell you, this vote is permanent. This isn't like a parliamentary election. So it's a very serious thing. Once it's given, cannot be retracted. Rebecca overhears this. And while Esau, poor dumb thing, is out hunting and working his himself to death to prepare this perfect meal for his blessing. She goes, "Come here, Jacob. We got to hurry and fix a great meal. I know how to do it. I've got half of it in the freezer in the tent. And, and we're going to do something to your father. I'm going to dress you up like Esau. And you're going to smell like he does from the outdoors. I'm going to put goat skin on your hands. And he's going to give you the blessing." Now, Jacob, understandably, is very nervous about this. But he does do it. And he goes in, and when he gets in there, you see, Isaac, last time I told you, after that horrible experience on Mount Moriah, when he was put on the altar and his father was ready to sacrifice him, and God spared this. I told you this, there's a Midrash story that God was so moved that God's tears fell into Isaac's eyes while he was lying there, and that Isaac never saw well again. I imagine he had more reaction to it than that on a human level. But he can't see very well. And, of course, Rebecca knows that. But he seems to sense something is wrong, and yet he goes ahead and blesses Jacob. And the speculation with some of these stories that are on your bibliography, some of these books, is that he too may have had a sense by now that Jacob was really more suitable to inherit the family name and become the patriarch. But that's what happened. He blesses him. And sure enough, Isaac, God bless him, comes back and, comes into the tent. "Hey, Dad, I've got the meal." And Isaac goes, "Who are you?" This is how Genesis, this wonderful author, puts it. Isaac said, "Who are you?" Esau said, "I'm your firstborn son, Esau." Then Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and blessed he shall be." When Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me also, Father." But Jacob said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and look, now he has taken away my blessing." Then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Isaac said, "What I have done, I have done." Esau said again, "Have you only one blessing, Father? Bless me also, Father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Great writing. The next sentence goes like this. Now Esau hated Jacob. I guess so. Understatement. It's more effective sometimes than overstatement. And he says, "After my father dies, I will kill my brother Jacob." You know who is listening. And she goes straight to Jacob, and this time she says, "You have got to get out of here right away. We don't know how long your father will live, and your brother's going to kill you. Just get out, and I'll send you, go up to where my brother Laban lives up north, up in Iraq, and be well, because you will be killed if you stay here." And without packing anything, Jacob takes off. And I don't think he ever sees his mother again. I know it was heartrending for her, but that's how much her son meant to her, that she would sacrifice being with him for his life. Then Jacob strolls along, I suppose, and can't walk any farther, so he lies down in a sort of wilderness place with a rock under his head and has the famous dream of Jacob's ladder. It's really a stairway. It's like a ziggurat from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. And God stands beside Jacob and says this, "I will give you this land, and your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you home." What a dream. What a dream we would give. I mean, what would we give to have a dream like that? as Barbara Taylor says, is this fair? This is a scoundrel who just stole his brother's birthright, and he is given a dream like this. Jacob, the two-timer and deceiver, did not deserve the dream he dreams. He has the dream that many law-abiding citizens would give anything to have. Is this fair? Do the elect get special dispensation, or do the elect notice more carefully? Who pays attention to your dreams? Do you? They often do give messages to us. And Buechner says, luckily for Jacob and for us, God does not love people because of who they are, but because of who God is. And this dreamer continues on. But this week, I was thinking a lot about these dreams. And I don't mean just dreams at night, but sometimes dreams at night, dreams where you have a dream and you don't know what to do about it. You think you're crazy, but you keep being drawn. And I kept thinking about the street ministry here with Pat Morgan, Pat, if it weren't for Pat, I don't think there would have ever been one, because she came down where we were just besieged with all these people, and we were handing out bus tickets and vouchers, and she said, she put up these signs everywhere that said, what is the root cause? And it stopped us short. And we didn't have any food, any clothing, any beds. All we did, was talk to people one-on-one. And her dream has made so much of ministry to the homeless possible. And another experience I had, totally unexpected, was from a young woman who had a dream, a real dream in her heart of starting a dance studio that would combine children from all over this community, of all cultures, all races, all ages, all economic, and it has come to be. And to listen to her tell this story just gave me chills. And I thought about both of those women today when I thought about people, tend to put down dreamers sometimes. We're going to meet a real dreamer again in Joseph in just a minute. Well, Jacob wakes up from his dream and gets to a well. That's in the Bible, when women and men meet at a well, it's usually a courtship scene. I won't go into Jesus' meeting at the well, but you might think about that next time you read that story. But Jacob comes to a well, and he sees Rachel there. It's love at first sight. Jacob's he's like acting like Esau. He's finally getting stronger. And he goes to this well, but there's a big stone over it, so that only the people in the village who belong there can drink. And the big, heavy, strong men haven't come. So he's standing there with Rachel and some of the women, and he heaves this huge millstone up and drops it to the ground. So he's the great hero, and he's really showing off for this girl he has fallen in love with the minute he saw her. She takes him home. Of course, as the Bible would have it, she is Rebekah's niece. Her father is Rebekah, his mother's uncle. But in those days, that was just perfectly fine. That was sort of, people preferred to marry somewhat within the family. And Jacob meets his match. I always picture Laban. I bring up all these old movie people, but some of you appreciate it. I think of Edward G. Robinson. Remember that oily kind of, he was my favorite villain. I can still see his face. Anyway, he reminds me of Laban. He's another schemer and a dealer. And Jacob and Laban, the Bible, these stories are fabulous. We haven't heard from God in a long time, but we don't have to, because God is probably laughing too. Anyway, he makes a deal. He says, Laban, I came up here without any money. I'll work for you free for 7 years if I can marry Rachel. Fine. And we all know what happens. 7 years pass. Jacob says, now it's time. They have a wedding. He goes into his own tent with his new wife, and the next morning he realizes it isn't Rachel. It's her sister Leah. Laban, he goes out and yells at Laban, you crook, just such justice. And Laban says, I forgot to tell you, but in our culture, the first daughters have to be the first married. But I'll tell you what I'll do. You can work another 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel. So I had to read this several times last night again, but here's what happened. He allows Jacob to marry Rachel a week later, after he and Leah have a marriage week, which is very interesting. If you want to read a really racy book about this, it's called The Red Tent, and it's quite graphic about, and Leah is the main character. But there's a very poignant writing in the Bible where Jacob is screaming, this isn't fair, I don't like her, she's ugly. And she hears this. You see, this culture, you hear everything. And I'm sure that was just horribly painful because she really likes her husband. And so a week later, he marries Rachel. Well, it is a nightmare. Leah becomes extraordinarily fertile. You'll see on your chart, and they're all sons, of course, they don't count, but son after son after son, and Rachel is just dying because she, as many of the famous women of the Bible, she is barren. One person said, this story is the best argument for monogamy in the whole Bible. Because you'll see on your chart that things get so crazy and bad. Rachel is so consumed with jealousy that she has her female slave, like Sarah got Hagar, to sleep with Jacob so that she will supposedly have 2 sons. And those are Dan and Naphtali. You'll never see these 12 tribes of Israel again, believe me, without thinking about the tent. And that's what just keeps happening. Finally, Joseph is born. And it's time to go home at last. Jacob has so many. Barbara Taylor says he's got 2 wives, 2 concubines, 11 sons, and he has a daughter named Dinah, or Dina, D-I-N-A-H. There's a whole chapter about her that I had enough ribbing about some of the things I told you last week, but that one is a really hot chapter, but I'm leaving it out. So does the story leave it out. Anyway, they decide that they're going home, and one last little turn of the screw is that by now, Jacob has learned how to breed cattle, and Laban had a huge herd, but they've tried to trick each other the whole time they've been there. And Jacob ends up learning how to crossbreed his herd so that they are thriving, and Laban is left with these little undernourished stick cattle. So Jacob takes all of his worldly possessions and all this horde of children and wives and women and all the trappings of that, pack up all those tents and head out. He is a nervous wreck about Esau. After all that time up there, maybe he's learned to appreciate another man in the family. I don't know. But he decides to take lavish gifts, all of the finest of his herd. And they come to a place called the River Jabbok, which the whole crew has to cross. He sends everybody else across, and then he goes back for the night. This is Jacob. And someone has told him on the other side that they've seen Esau and that he is headed out with about 200 men. And Jacob feels sure that he is going to be killed. So he finally prays a prayer to God that does not have a, if you do this, I'll do that. He doesn't try to make a deal anymore. He says, God, if you please, deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother. And that's the night when he goes to sleep again, and something happens. We call it that he wrestled with an angel. One of the most famous and most thought-provoking stories in all the Bible. It is hard to imagine the struggle that took place because Jacob he struggles so hard with this person, asking for a blessing, asking, who are you? No answers until the man breaks his hip. And it is probably a man in this vision. Barbara Taylor has a fine sermon on this, and she asks this, have we tamed God? She said, most of us long for protection and prosperity, and it's fine to ask for that, but no one in her right mind asks to be attacked, frightened, and wounded, and yet that is how sometimes it comes, the presence and blessing of God. Think of times when you have wrestled and didn't know how you were going to get up and go the next morning. You had to do things you thought you would never do, and you found yourself suddenly blessed. Don't let anyone convince you, she says, that if it were really God, it would not be so scary, and it certainly wouldn't hurt. Hang on until you get a blessing, and then thank God and limp all the way home, just like he did. Buechner calls it the magnificent defeat. In the course of all this, and I was thinking too about the Roosevelts and how I noticed the segment I saw last night, he got the polio. I mean, I had never seen pictures of Roosevelt as a tall, strapping, handsome, debonair guy. I'd seen a lot of him in his wheelchair. And I thought, and others commented, that the polio broke him in a way, took some of that arrogance and self-assurance. And I really thought about how Jacob, having this hip broken, some of you have had broken hips, and it's not a picnic. And if you thought God had broken your hip on purpose, how would you feel about God? But that's this story. And then even more wonderful is when Esau does meet up with him. It's verse 33 or chapter 30, I don't know which it is. And Esau runs to meet him, embraces him, kisses him, and they both weep. What do you mean by all these gifts? Said Esau. I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. It's as if the Garden of Eden was completely overshadowed. Cain and Abel have been healed, and this is a wonderful, wonderful ending. Eventually, Rachel dies. In the course of her death, she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. Isaac dies at age 180, old and full of days, and his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him together. And this Bible names Esau first. When you're looking at the scriptures, look and watch for things like that. Suddenly, that's Jacob and Esau, it's Esau. Naomi Rosenblatt says, though we do not hear Jacob's grieving for Rachel, it will have profound consequences, his grief, for the whole family, because Jacob, like many bereaved spouses, will transfer his emotional attachment to the most tangible link to his dead wife, in this case, her child, Joseph. Joseph is his favorite. Wouldn't you think by now he would have learned what parental favoritism can do to a family? Not at all. So God bless him. He probably needs to get his other hip broken. But the next story is a pure story. Joseph is familiar to you all, and probably for the reason, Chris comes up to me and he said, did you wear that coat of many colors on purpose? I did, because it's the only cool coat I have downstairs right now. But anyway, here's what one person says about the Joseph story. There he is. You want my coat of many colors? With a plot worthy of Shakespeare, the story of Joseph has everything in it: passion, foreign intrigue, reversal, and revenge. Throughout it all, Joseph blossoms like some ancient Cinderella. And that's really what it's like. It's almost a story like Cinderella's. I say God is never mentioned specifically in this whole book, except that Joseph refers to him frequently, repeatedly. And this story is very important as a link to what we will have next week with Chris, which is the story of the Exodus. Because we end up, of course, down in Egypt. And we move, here's what Walter Brueggemann says, with this story of Joseph, we move ever closer to the mysterious ways of God's providence in the ways of the world. Invited or not, God will be present. And this story is in the real world of that day. starts like this. This is the story of the family of Jacob. It really isn't, but that's what it says. Watch out what you read. Joseph, then it goes on, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with 4 of his brothers. Joseph brought a bad report to them, to their father. Tattletale. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. The word in Latin for sleeves means many colors. That's why we call it that. But in the Bible, it's a long-sleeved robe because people with long sleeves, men with long sleeves, couldn't do any work. They couldn't do any real work. In other words, he was dressed like a regal, with all the other boys out working hard. He paraded around, and he was a big tattletale. He was a spoiled brat tattletale. And the brothers hate him, naturally. And they hate him even more, despise him, because he has dreams that he stars in, and he's the Lord of all of them. And he tells them all about his dreams. This is not the kind of dream one wants to pass on when one is the main character and one lords it over all of the others. But that's what they kept. So they plot revenge. One day when they're way far away from their father, they take off his robe and throw him in a pit. And then one of them says, I don't know if we want his death on our hands. And they sit down to have a picnic, celebrating they've gotten rid of this boy to a certain extent. And they then see a caravan coming of traders, and they say, let's just give them him so we haven't killed him. They sell him into slavery. And then they get a goat, kill it, and smear it with blood. And they take it back to the trickster, and they say, look at this coat. And he really, truly believes that his son has died. Meanwhile, the author writes, the traders had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Potiphar is high up, one of Pharaoh's officials, as it says. He immediately makes Joseph the overseer of his house. And then we have a little aside. Someone calls it the Egyptian version of Desperate Housewives. Mrs. Potiphar tries to seduce Joseph, who's very handsome, but he refuses and he flees, and then she reports that he attacked her. He's put into jail where he interprets dreams. In the jail is one of the servants of Pharaoh. He says to Pharaoh, you've got somebody in jail who can really interpret dreams. Joseph is sent for. He begins to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh takes him out of jail and makes him, basically he becomes what is like the prime minister of Egypt. And that's where his real story takes off as far as his relationship with his family. Because, just as the dreams had predicted, there is a famine that comes. Because of the interpretation that Joseph gave, Pharaoh has stored up grain. And so in Canaan, Jacob and but he leaves Benjamin. He's not going to let that other son of Rachel loose. But he sends the other boys down to try to buy grain from Pharaoh. Joseph meets them, but they don't know who he is. Because, meanwhile, he has married an Egyptian woman. He has 2 sons. And fascinating, he's cut off his beard. He has really become an Egyptian. And Walter Brueggemann says that's the reason, when you talk about the patriarchs, often when prayer C in our Eucharist is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, no Joseph. And he says that's because he shaved off his beard. He's not a real Jew anymore. Take what you will. Tell Andrew Lloyd Webber that. I also noticed yesterday, when you read the Bible, you find things in current events. This article about Joseph's coat, did you read in the one of the sections? About the M section, a couple who has a ministry in Zambia, and they call it Joseph's Coat. And they have gone to Africa and been very effective. And they named it that, it said, because Joseph was a great administrator and a dreamer. And they had always dreamed of doing a ministry like that. So finally, after wonderful, wonderful writing, back and forth with these brothers, many times back and forth, meeting up with them, and they don't know who he is. Finally, Joseph is overcome by emotion, and he announces, "I am Joseph." One of you in here, a good friend of mine, I'm getting ready to read her very favorite passage, I believe, in the Bible. When the brothers react with fear, Joseph says, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good." And they make up, and that's how this wonderful, remarkable book concludes. And I wanted to end by reading you the ending of one of the commentaries I've been using, Naomi Rosenblatt. And she says the two phrases that define Genesis are "go forth" and "fear not." Go forth. Go forth into life. Go forth on your journey and discover your personal destiny, your life's destination. Do not wait for life to come to you, to rescue you. Go forth and find a mate, build a family, repair your community. Fear not. Go forth into life and fear not its vagaries. Fear not its struggles, not its doubt, the doubt that besieges all faith. Fear not the pain that comes with love and the hurt that comes with compassion. Fear not the unknown. Bless life and seize the day. Go forth and fear not. But how? By always reminding ourselves that we are created in God's image, that we are endowed with intellect and free will, compassion and responsibility, conscience and creativity, that what we do matters, that our life and all life is infinitely precious. Go forth and fear not. Amen. Thank you. See you next week.